You ever walk into a school library and just wonder? Like, is this actually a good one? It seems like such a simple question, but the story of how we even started to figure that out is, well, way more complicated than you'd think. So let's dive into this journey of standards, measurement, and what really makes a library tick.
For decades, believe it or not, these were the exact questions that were stumping everyone, from the school principal all the way down to the librarians themselves. I mean, it's one thing to see a room full of books, but so what? How do you actually measure its worth to the students and teachers it's supposed to be helping?
So the first attempt to answer this was, well, the most obvious one, right? Just count stuff. The thinking was, hey, if you can put a number on it, you can make a rule about it. And that kicked off the whole era of the quantitative approach.
What's pretty wild when you look at this timeline is just how fast that whole idea started to show its cracks. The first big standards dropped in 1918, but just a decade later, people were already starting to push back. They just felt like the numbers weren't telling the whole story. And by 1945, that dissatisfaction led to a whole new, blended approach.
So, what kind of stuff were they actually counting? Well, it was pretty much exactly what you'd guess. The number of books, the size of the budget, how many people were on staff, even how many credit hours of training they had. Heck, they measured the seating capacity and the dimensions of the room itself. It was all about these tangible, easy-to-check boxes that created a very clear, but also very inflexible baseline.
And that inflexibility, that became the huge problem. People started to have this dawning realization that a library could have 1,000 of the correct books, but if nobody ever used them, it was basically failing. Meanwhile, a smaller, more focused library might be a roaring success. The numbers alone, they just weren't cutting it.
And this really lays out the core conflict, doesn't it? On one side, you have the numbers approach. It's straightforward, it's easy to enforce, and it sets a clear minimum. But it can also be super rigid and restrictive. On the other side, you've got the quality approach, which is all about being flexible and purpose-driven. But man, is it a lot harder to measure. How do you put a number on quality? That was the puzzle.
This quote, this just nails it. This is the turning point right here. It basically says that just owning a bunch of library stuff wasn't a good enough reason to exist. It was the use of those materials that really mattered. The whole focus shifted from just possessing things to having a real purpose.
And that shift led to a totally new way of thinking, which was actually pretty revolutionary for its time. Start judging a library based on how well it actually connects with the school's educational goals.
So this new model was built around something called qualitative standards. And what that really means is the library stopped being seen as just, a warehouse for books sitting off in a corner. It became this dynamic, living, breathing part of the whole teaching and learning process.
This became the new mantra. The idea was that a library's success is directly tied to the success of the school's curriculum. Is it supporting the history classes? Does it have what kids need for the science fair? That's what started to matter most.
Okay, this all sounds great, right? A huge improvement. But there was a catch. Putting this new, better philosophy into practice was, well, it got messy, fast. Because how do you actually measure integration? How do you standardize something as fuzzy as quality?
Let's just take librarian certification, for example. The requirements were all over the map. You had some states that wanted a full-blown major in library science, while others were like, 12 or 15 hours is fine. There was absolutely no consensus across the country.
And it wasn't just the states. The regional groups that were supposed to be setting standards couldn't agree with each other either. You can see here, one group might say you need a full-time librarian once you hit 500 students, but another one would set that same bar at 200. It was just a total patchwork of conflicting rules.
And of course, the confusion extended to money too. Funding standards varied wildly. Some states required 50 cents per student, while others demanded $1.50. That's 3 times as much. So trying to apply these new ideas about quality in any kind of uniform way was proving to be incredibly difficult.
But, and this is the really cool part of the story, even with all that confusion and disagreement, something great happened. The struggle itself, just the act of having the conversation and trying to figure out what a good library even was, that led to real, solid improvements across the board.
Seriously, the effort really paid off. Because people were now focused on standards, schools started getting more materials. States began hiring actual library specialists. Teacher training programs started to include how to use the library as a teaching tool. The entire profession was elevated.
So where did we end up after all this? Well, pretty much in the best of both worlds. The modern approach recognizes that you really do need both. You need that quantitative baseline, a minimum number of books, a decent budget.
but you also need to measure how that library is truly serving the unique needs of its school.
When you step back and look at it, this whole history is a journey from a very simple question of how many to a much more profound question of how effective. It's a shift from just counting things to measuring real impact. And that kind of leaves us with a big question to chew on, doesn't it? Where else in our lives, our work or our communities, are we still just counting things when we should be measuring their true impact?